Hello, everyone, and welcome to Genealogy Live Interview Series 5 Names and Lights. It was about three different names, but we'll go with it. It's great that I've been able to start this again with a cast of six new people. However, the specific dates as to when all of them are going, I have some confirmed and some names, but I'll get to that and I'll let all of you know as in when. But we have our guest tonight and kicking off series 5. She's a legal genealogist, the genealogist with a law degree. It is Judy G. Russell. Hello, Judy.
Hello, Daniel. How are you doing?
Uh, I'm well. I just opened that my internet decided not to out, and this will go relatively smoothly because considering these are all eventually going to be podcast episodes, we just have the deadlist and that good quality.
We'll cross our fingers.
So I guess we better get started. So for those that aren't aware of you and your work, could you introduce yourself?
I can. The first thing that people should know, of course, is that I am an American. I live on the east coast of the United States, currently about 10 miles as the crow flies from lower Manhattan. I live in the state of New Jersey. I am a Colorado native, but my mother's family is 100% from the United States South. We have been in America since before there was an America, but all of it in the southern United States. On my father's side, he didn't arrive in the United States until he was almost 4 years old. He was born in Germany in 1921 and came over with his parents and settled in Chicago. So I am colonial American on one side and entirely German immigrant on the other side. And that makes for some very interesting quirks in my research. I do have a law degree. I have an undergraduate degree from George Washington University in journalism and political science, and then a law degree from Rutgers, which is the State University of New Jersey. I came to genealogy the way that most people do. There were some family stories that I had heard, and I wanted to know if they could possibly be true. So that's how I got to be where I am today.
And I think it's kind of the whole thing, that's curiosity, when you're when you kind of hear stories from like an older family member and you hear, oh, well, my grandmother did this, and then you think, oh, I wonder if that's true, or what can I prove? And that sets you off on a really, really crazy journey. I mean, it was, I'm your research must take you everywhere with the way that you have it, in the sense that, as you said, you colonial American on one side and then uh German immigrant on the other side. So it's your research itself is taking you very different places. I gather.
Absolutely. And of course, the difficulty in the United States South, and I realize this is very hard for people, particularly in the UK and Ireland and Australia and places with standard recordation of births, marriages, and deaths. It's hard for you guys to understand. But many, many jurisdictions in the American South did not begin standard recordation of vital data until the 20th century. So the idea of finding an 1841 birth record or that sort of thing is absolutely alien in that part of the United States. So there's a real difficulty in finding direct evidence of relationships in particularly in the American South. And then when I switch over to my father's side and I'm researching there, although the records tend to be much better thanks to Napoleon and civil registration, I'm dealing in a language issue that has to be overcome. I do read basic German, but when you're dealing in records in a foreign language, there's nuance in the language that you can miss. It's a little bit like I wear a sweater, you wear a jumper. And that's the kind of nuance that can be missed easily by an English speaker working in German or French or Italian or Spanish. So there are challenges to be overcome for all of us in our research, that's for sure.
Yeah, and I mean, to be honest, I just love a change scenery from mine because, from my parents on both sides, oh, it's our it's like none of them was like, oh, there wasn't one born in the UK or one just to be a sneak one born in France. It's in the same place, never moved. And it's like, surely wanted to move, just give them a little fur field, even little, just maybe the next village over. No, just stayed. So,
I I would almost kill for one generation that stayed in the same place. Now, my father's family, I must say, his mother's family stayed in the city of Bremen, probably from the
right,
1600s on, or just right in the suburbs of Bremen. My grandfather's family, my father's family, was from further east, close to, well, in an area that was East Germany. So they were more transient on that side. But on my mother's family side, just as one example, I have one set of third great grandparents that they were born in North Carolina, which is the United States South. They moved to a different part of North Carolina, then to a part of the state of Kentucky, then to the state of Iowa, and then ended up dying in the state of Texas. So mine had itchy feet right from the very beginning. Nobody stayed in one place for multiple generations. And that's a problem because you don't have the church records to follow and you don't have the local records, and it can pose some real challenges.
I, I got it. Well, for me, it's just, oh, you stayed in Hiroshima. What a surprise. It was, they just stayed in the one place. It's just like, hey, you sit there. Oh. And then you have, because my mother is from Dungarvan. Uh, it was funny because I was looking through Twitter one time and it said, oh, Kate Bush, they're saying Kate Bush's mother's family is from Dungarvan. And I instantly said to Mum, if I find out we're related, and it'd be fantastic. I mean, the name that shows up in her side doesn't show up in mine, and I'm hoping, hoping that just find the name somewhere. I don't care if it's 5 generations away, I will find it. But that's a work in progress. So, what sources have you found most helpful? Because obviously, dealing with two completely different areas, I imagine you probably would have used a wide variety of resources.
One of the resources that I think genealogists miss are the local genealogical societies. They have an insight into the records and the practices of the local community that is, you couldn't pay enough to get that. So for example, I am not a native German speaker, but even with my broken German, I can be a member of the Bremen Genealogical Society, which is called Die Maus, because there's a little mouse in the cathedral in Bremen. They have records and assistance and the ability to go to the archives and look things up, even during the pandemic. They know what records survived because Bremen, of course, was badly damaged in the bombings during World War II. And they know where those records are. whether they're in the state archives or a church archives, or whether they actually have them on microfilm at DMouse. I have exactly the same situation, but multiplied, of course, in the American jurisdictions. The little tiny genealogical societies that cover one county in one state are going to know more about what records existed, when, what time periods they covered, and they know about records that were never microfilmed. And Dick Eastman from Eastman's Genealogy, the newsletter, once wrote, and this couldn't have been more than 5 or 6 years ago, that in his estimation, no more than 5 to 10% of the genealogically relevant records that had ever been created had ever even been microfilmed, much less digitized. So we're talking road trips to get to vast amounts of records. Now, who knows what those records are and where they are? It's the locals. So we need to budget in our research budgets for memberships in those local societies to guide us through finding some of the clues that we're just not going to find any other way.
And I do agree. I'm a member of two different societies, one for study and one for Irish research. And the Irish ones obviously are probably quite well known. But yeah, I have found them of value, and they do offer many different perks. I found, and you do get so much information from the talk or the newsletters they send out, and it is. I wholeheartedly agree. So, what projects of interest are you currently pursuing? And obviously, we know you're very well known for your blog, but is there any other little bits you're putting on with at the moment?
What I try to do, because I am a certified genealogist, I hold credentials from the Board for Certification of Genealogists, is to get away from looking at other people's research questions and focus for my recertification projects on things that are in my own family. So at least every 5 years, I'm trying to complete a major research project on something in my own ancestry. So the first recertification that I had, my question was about an ancestor who was a real, honest to goodness rascal. He was just, for those who know American history, the state of Texas didn't join the United States until the 1840s. It had originally been part of the Spanish Empire, and then it became part of the Mexican Empire, and then it declared independence from Mexico and was the Republic of Texas for 10 years. And this particular ancestor qualifies me for membership in an organization called the Daughters of the Republic of Texas. Now, you have to prove that your ancestor lived in the Republic of Texas. Well, that's really easy for me because mine was indicted by the Republic of Texas for the crimes of bigamy and adultery in the 1840s. So George is my favorite ancestor. He's an absolute rascal. And the problem was trying to prove that the George I knew I was descended from was the same George who was the guy who was indicted for bigamy and adultery. So that was one big project, trying to prove that. Pure documents, no DNA possible to be used in that case, but a documentary case that I then wrote up for the National Genealogical Society Quarterly in the United States. And then the second time I went for recertification, which was just I turned it in at the end of last year and was recertified at the beginning of this year, was a case that combined documentary evidence and DNA evidence, because the question was identifying a fourth great grandmother. The fourth great grandfather had been married twice. He ran off with the woman who became wife number 2 while he was still married to wife number 1. So my gal could have been descended from either wife. And then trying to establish which one of this guy's 2 wives was Margaret's mother was the big issue there. So that's mitochondrial DNA. And so that was fun. It was a pain because, as you know, women change their surnames every time they marry. And so trying to trace those lines of descent was a challenge, but it finally came through, and we were able to determine that my line at least does definitely descend from the second wife and not the first wife.
Wow. I mean, I don't like that. That would obviously throw us down in the works, but also for my family in Ireland, it would be unheard of because it's this case of, oh well, lived and obviously don't need to be married again. Usually, if the person had the first wife or the spouse died, and for I was looking at my own grandfather, so not far back, and found out that he had been married once before, the second wife, which is where I descend from. Um, but it was the first wife died, but for some reason he put himself down as a bachelor again on his marriage cert. I did actually look and I did investigate, I promise you, and it is him. He put himself as bachelor again down on his second marriage certificate. I found the wife, I found the first wife, and it seems so eerie because they married on the 13th of March 1910. She died in June of it was to do with severe morning sickness because she was pregnant at the time. So unfortunately, she passed away due to that. And then he married again to my great grandmother Ellen on the 15th of March 1911. It was like a year and 2 days after his first marriage. He married my great grandmother. So
Wow.
it yeah. I mean I was floored thinking, is that really him? But like it was basically the spitting image, and I know you're thinking, well, John Loftus is obviously a common name. It is, but it was because Luke, which was his brother, was listed as a witness, living at the same place. And there weren't many Lukes, so I could easily kind of pinpoint if it was him, and sure
Well,
enough, it
plus
was.
the
So,
the address really helps.
oh,
Now,
extremely.
the bottom line though is that what the lesson you learned, and you
Hmm.
learned it a lot earlier than I ever did. So I'm jealous of you for starting your genealogy so young. The lesson here is that even those vital records, those critically important vital records, can have mistakes on them. Some of
Hmm.
them inadvertent, some of them because they didn't understand the question, some of them quite deliberate. But he may have said to the clerk, well, we didn't have any children. My wife died after 2 months. How should I list myself? And the clerk said, oh, just write yourself as a bachelor. We don't know because we weren't there. He certainly wasn't divorced, so he didn't have any of the
No.
issues with a remarriage. But
I mean, there was a scandalous story behind it all, like just kind of because I'm sorry, your uncles and when I was talking to her about it, she gave me this random, most crazy story you think it was out of a movie scene. And I said, like, yay, and just kind of the story was, I won't go into it fully, but it was just a case of he was accused of oh, forgotten to now, great. It'll come in a minute, but it was essentially supposedly he was thrown off her land as her father was a Welsh farmer, and it was he was apparently thrown off their land and basically dumped. And I don't know, it wasn't right. It was a case of she unfortunately died of morning sickness 2 months in. But yeah, I mean that's probably about as second wife sort of thing happened. Like it never, apart from that, is the 1,000.
That sort of thing is going to happen a lot, though. And again, we have to
Yeah,
be on guard for those kinds of misstatements, and we have to be on guard for the deliberate misstatement as well. I got a copy of my grandparents' marriage license, which was in the state of Texas in 1916. Now, my grandparents were both born in 1898, which means they were both 18 years old. Now, a girl in Texas was old enough to marry without parental consent at 18. But a boy in Texas needed to be 21 to marry without parental consent. And now that's very common throughout the English common law system, that you're going to have these age differences based on gender, and particularly in marriage. You go all the way to Blackstone, and it's 14 for a boy and 12 for a girl. So it's older here in the ninth than oh yeah, a girl could marry at 12 in now she needed parental
wow,
consent, but she could marry at 12
yeah,
in the olden days. So here you have this 18-year-old boy. His mother has
mm,
died. His father is a traveling salesman and off someplace and not connected to the family at this point. So what does he do? He crosses, they were actually living in Oklahoma. They crossed the river into the nearest Texas county, and he went in front of a judge who didn't know him, and he lied and said he was 21. And that's going to happen all the time. We didn't
mm,
have to produce driver's licenses or passports or any other kind of evidence. If you were a big husky kid in 1916, you could say you were 21, and the judge was going to take it at face value. So
mm.
that's what happened in that case. So we need to be careful when we're looking
Yeah,
at those records.
definitely. So what? Oh, comes the question: is there anything that you now know you wish you would start?
Oh, there's so much. I could give you a laundry list. The biggest thing is, um, I wish I had understood when I started that genealogy has always been largely a hobby and not a profession for most genealogists. Because when I first got started and I came across published genealogies, I was not thinking about the need to verify the work that had been done by others. And so my early genealogical records, my data files and stuff like that, are chock full of things that came from published family histories that were pure fiction. There is not a shred of evidence to back them up at all. There's a lovely story in my family about us descending from Alexander Baker of Boston. And the Alexander Baker came to Boston is supposedly the son of an English royal surgeon who came to America in 1635 on this ship, the Elizabeth and Anne. And then we descend from Alexander's son Samuel, and Samuel married into the Winslow family. That's the Mayflower people in Massachusetts. And then they had a son named William, and William went to Virginia, and he was a member of the Virginia House of Burgesses, which was the colonial legislature. And George Washington slept at his house. None of it None of it is true. There's not a shred of evidence to support any of it. And there is absolute evidence now to disprove most of it. For example, we have documented DNA from the Alexander Baker descendants as opposed to my Baker family. And if there is a common ancestor between those two sets of Bakers, it's back somewhere around Adam and Eve. There's no relationship between those Baker lines at all. So I wish I had known more about never taking anybody else's research as gospel. That everything is a trust but verify situation. I would have made a lot fewer mistakes to start with. So that's
Yeah,
probably the big one.
I think that's definitely a good one because I'm doing research for a cousin at the moment, and I'm doing research on her family. And it's mainly her father's family I'm doing because her mother's is where I'm connected. Obviously I documented that back. But with this, I was trying to, see what this ancestry member had said and to try and verify it. Half of it was wrong because, it was saying, oh, there are 8 children and only 5 of them were in the census, and this person plucked 3 children with the supposed names out of thin air. With the source being ancestry member trees, of which that one did not exist anymore, and that the 3 children separate the other 5 their own source. When I looked at the tree, it said 30,000 people in this tree, and wow. I mean, my one I don't think even has 700. I think I'm shy 600 maybe. I don't do very expensive, but it's just I get confused with people that are in my tree, let alone I don't know how you'd even remember. Oh yeah, that's Mary Smith. 13,000 14 times removed or something. I don't know, or who the wife of my uncle or something. It's like it's so advanced. I don't know how, and I still don't know where this family that I'm researching fits into the greater of the tree, considering it's so vast.
Well, a
So
3,000
yeah,
person tree, if it's well documented and it's a tree that's down as opposed to one that's going back into the 1500s or 1400s, is not really outrageous. If there are big
mm,
families. I mean, for example, my grandmother's one of my grandmother's cousins had 13 children. My my own grandparents had 12 children, 10 of whom lived to adulthood. So I have 40 some odd first cousins just on my mother's side. So
right,
that's not that amazing.
yeah,
It's the ones that have 30,000 people, and the only source for any of them are other ancestry family trees. Those are the ones where I step back and I think long and hard. Now, I do want to emphasize, though, and I think Tom Jones makes this point as better than probably anybody else. And he wrote an article which is free for anybody to access on the Board for Certification of Genealogists website. And it's called The Perils of Source Snobbery. And what he means by that is even an unsourced ancestry tree can be right. And it can, at a minimum, have clues that might be worth following up. And even a marriage record like your great grandfather's or my grandfather's that we tend to think will be accurate because they were swearing to that information, can have mistakes or deliberate misstatements. So it's not so much the size of the tree that makes me step back and really want to take a look. It's the sourcing. I've
Yeah.
seen some trees where the depth of the sources that are cited is it's just really, really good. But then I've seen trees that like the one that just makes me giggle every time I see it. My That fourth great grandmother that I identified through mtDNA is a woman by the name of Anne Jacobs. And she was born somewhere around 1800 in the southern American state of South Carolina. And there must be 500 trees on Ancestry that identify her parents as a couple from Belgium who never left Belgium, whose children were all born in Belgium, who died in Belgium, and who would have been like in their 60s when Anne was born. So how they
Yeah.
managed to connect her to this Belgian couple is absolutely beyond my comprehension. But it gets repeated by people who just
Yeah.
click, yeah, I'll add that whole line to my tree. And it's all based on somebody who made a mistake, 5 years ago, and it's just getting repeated. So some of it can be a hint. Some of it is just so wrong. It's laughable.
Mm. Yeah. I mean, I'll take my little just of you if you have stuff 500 ancestry memories, just potentially sharing your ancestors, because I'd be lucky if I get one. Like anywhere I be, like my ancestors are like had between the range 4 to 8 or no 4 to 10. That the range of methods that I've seen in my family, and only one of I found does genealogy, but this individual ghosted me after one email, so I do not have any cousins, or well, close-ish distant cousins, like a couple of sister ones here and there, but just no one closer. Just like somewhere must be, but I'm hoping one day.
And then, of
So
course, you know, as
go ahead.
as nice as it is to have cousins who are interested, and I've got a fabulous first cousin who's actually one of the co-administrators of the genetic genealogy tips and tricks session on Facebook. So she's really good. As nice as it is to have that, it's the ones who pop up out of the woodwork, who see something that you've written or you've posted, and they end up having little bits and pieces to add that you would never have come up with otherwise. I have a lovely second cousin who lives in California, and let's see, this is her grandmother was the older sister of my great grandfather. So she's my second cousin once removed. My great grandfather died he wasn't even 40 years old. So my grandmother didn't even have a photograph of him that had survived through the years. But as a young man, he had had a photograph taken and sent it to his older sister. And
Oh,
and
brilliant.
so it survived in that line of the family. And on the back was written, grandma's brother Jap. His name was Jasper. And so she knew who it was. And when we finally connected, She said, "Well, I have this picture of Jasper Robertson. Would you like a copy?" Like, would I like a copy? Yes, please. Those sorts of serendipitous moments are
Yeah,
just the best parts of doing genealogy.
absolutely. I mean, and I've officially concluded that I will only ever have photos of six of my eight grandparents because unfortunately there was no photo of them taken. On this line in my mother's, sorry, excuse me, my father's side, on my grandmother's, there was eight children, only three of them went on to kids, and two of the lines didn't have any further. So it's basically after they go, it's just my line continuing on, and it, it's just so sad. I mean, my father remembers his grandfather, thank you, but he doesn't remember his own mother, so we don't get
That's
sort of
really
from
sad.
them.
That's
I know.
really, really sad. But then of course you've got the people, particularly on Ancestry, who insist on identifying photographs as ancestors who died before photography was available. And
See,
that's that, really, people, this is not Elizabeth Brewer. She died before 1860. There were no commercial photographers in that part of the United States in the 1850s. That is absolutely positively not Elizabeth Brewer Shue. I'm promising you that. And they still have her photograph all over the places. This is Elizabeth.
and you
No.
copy thing that says when was photography invented, and you send that to them, no context. But no, I mean, one thing that did sort of bring a lot of hope before I came to that conclusion was when I had Brick Wall Busters, the Twitter chat that went on, it's been gone, I think, a year or two now. But no, or no, actually a year, even 5 months. But when it was still here, I was getting stuck on one thing, and it was a great grandaunt of mine. I could never find out what happened to her because she went by about three different nicknames in her life. Uh, she was Ellen Agnes Lavin, and she ended up being Hilda, Aggie, Nellie. I don't know where it came from, but we'll go with it. And she married a man named William Death, and I could never figure out where they ended up. And until little Grave came to uh, the rescue, and then I found a thing to start off from, and eventually proved that this was my great granddaughter. Lo and behold, there was a passport photo of her as well as one of her daughters, which I couldn't believe either. It was so like the photo was her, my great grandaunt, and her daughter sitting on her lap, and it was a passport to go back. So that made me realize that they did go back to visit family, which is so nice. Because
Absolutely. And I
the
think this
granddad, oh,
well, this gives us a
you
good opportunity to say something good about Find a Grave for a change.
yeah,
So many of us have got difficulties with the people who rush to post current materials, but I don't want to take 1 inch away from all of the amazing volunteers who have
yeah,
gone into the cemeteries all over the world and walked those lines and taken those photos and documented the burials and looked at the cemetery records and added in those historical obituaries from the 1800s and the early 1900s and given families opportunities to add family photographs. The genealogical and historical value of that work is beyond measure. And,
Hmm.
I know that a lot of Find a Grave volunteers, identify me as like the Antichrist. I'm the one who's always yelling at them for what they're doing. But I really want to single out the people who do the historical work as fabulous folks and people who are so valuable to the genealogical community. And I want to thank them for all of their time and all of their effort, because without those kinds of entries, without that kind of record, particularly when we're at a distance, if we've got people who live in Australia and their ancestors were from Canada or the UK or Ireland, and you have me living in the United States and my ancestors from Germany. They don't have a lot of headstones in Germany because Europe reuses the cemeteries,
I know.
but fabulous photos of the cemeteries, which are
Yeah.
beautiful. They're like parks. So I'm very, very grateful to the historical Find a Grave volunteers, and I want that to be clear, that there
Yeah.
is an enormous service that they have done and are doing, and I don't want to lump them in with the group that is off doing their own current thing.
Yeah. Definitely. And I think one thing that did come handy was, well as Ellie, was at the end he ended up going by most of her life, uh, which obviously is like Hilda. She's like Hilda in one sense. It didn't make sense, but it was her. And it's not as if you couldn't hear the name, Ellen. Oh, Hilda Oakdax. I mean, it is doesn't make sense, but I don't know. Maybe she was. But one thing that it did come in handy for was my granddad, um, who ended up and her husband ended up dying in New York. That's one of my grandmother's cousins, and my parents obviously went over and had been over since, and never saw the grave. And you know, it was this look on the grave at their hints, and it did come up a match for both of them. So I did, and my dad actually get to see the headstone of his aunt and his uncle. So it was definitely flat, and weirdly enough, the cousin who's still currently living is actually on my grave as well. So I need to actually look into trying to get rid of that memorial because she's not dead yet.
Yeah,
But it is
there's always
on that
that.
stone. There's no end date.
That's I have the same situation. I have a cousin who is listed in one cemetery in Virginia because her first husband died very young, and his parents bought a double headstone and
Yeah.
engraved all, both names, his birth and death date, and her birth year. Well, she went on to remarry, have children with the second husband, and is never going to be buried in that cemetery. So there are those issues as well. But
Yeah. Yeah, I could
genealogy
imagine.
poses some interesting problems.
It does. It does, definitely. So, what aspect of genealogy do you love most? So, the historical records, the photos, what is it for you?
I think it's the fact that we're solving puzzles all the time. It's a little bit like a jigsaw puzzle, except you don't know where the pieces are and you don't know what the picture is supposed to look like when you're finished. A lot of people go into a genealogical puzzle thinking they do know what the picture is. And that's a mistake, because you never know until you found all of the reasonably accessible pieces. We say that genealogy has to encompass reasonably exhaustive research for a reason. We don't want to be crazy about this. There's a reason for putting that reasonably into that phrase. But we need to try to gather up everything we can before we start drawing conclusions. Otherwise, we tend up getting misled, like I did as a baby genealogist, when it looked perfectly reasonable that you would go from Massachusetts to Connecticut to Virginia. It was only when I learned more that I realized that no, they didn't do that back then. So it's the puzzle, but the puzzle itself involves all of that social history and historical context and the economic context and the military context. And there's a difference between somebody who was learned and could read and write and somebody who was illiterate and was barely hanging on as a tenant farmer. The conditions of their lives and the circumstances and the records that they would have created and where you look for the records is all going to be influenced by all of those factors. And you probably know this better than I do because of the division in Ireland between Protestant and Catholic and the enormous dichotomy in the records, particularly the local records and the church records that would have existed because of that.
Absolutely. And obviously, Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland obviously have different kind of rules because, for instance, if you were trying to do civil registration in Northern Ireland, it would start from 1864 like it down here. And then obviously when Ireland was declared independent in 1921, from 1922 onwards, civil registrations in Northern Ireland were now in the GRO, or Groney General Office of Northern Ireland. So, like, you get so far in Northern Ireland, and you have to go direct to Groney and your documents for on. So yes, it does change in that regard. But the closest line ever to Northern Ireland was Mayo, and obviously that's often left a bit, so not quite. So what's an interest? Oh, this should be good. What an interesting story or event that you've discovered in your family?
Oh, it's where do you start? Probably the best story that I've discovered, and it really wasn't so much out of genealogy, but just out of my family, was when I was a kid, and I was 10 years old, and I went up into my parents' attic, and I was looking in some boxes that I probably wasn't supposed to be looking in, and I found a couple of photographs, and one of them was my father in a tuxedo next to a woman in a wedding gown who quite clearly was not my mother. And then underneath that photograph was the photograph of a little boy. Now, my father was a German immigrant. And if you know anything about German immigrants, you know that you do not go downstairs from looking in a box you're not supposed to be looking in and say to your German immigrant parent, "Dad, what do you know about these photographs?" So I waited until I was much older and literally ready to go off to university. And I asked him then. And all that time, I believed that I had a brother. Now, I've got a lot of brothers, trust me. My mother had 7 children, so I got a lot of siblings, but this one I didn't know about. So he gave me some information, and confirmed that, yes, in fact, he had been married before and that there was a boy from that first marriage. And it took me a while to track him down. And I had a lot of trouble because I was a kid. I wish I knew when I was your age what you know at your age. And I didn't. I didn't even know what the word genealogy meant when I was your age.
Yeah.
So I was at a standstill And the one clue I hadn't followed up on was an address and the name of my brother's grandfather, his mother's father, from 25 years earlier. So I picked up the telephone and I called information in the city where my brother's grandfather was supposed to live. And I asked for that name at that address. And they actually had a phone number. His grandfather had never moved. So I got up my courage and I called, and an older man answered the phone, and I asked for my brother by his birth name, which turned out not to be the name he goes by. And there was dead silence on the phone. And then he says, who are you and why are you calling? And, at that moment, you're thinking, how do I explain myself to this man that he's going to let me contact my brother? And so he finally, I gave him the information, and he finally said, well, look, I'm not going to tell you where he is, but I will promise you this. If you send me a letter, send it to him, care of me, I will see that he gets it. And then it's up to him to make his own decision on whether he wants to be in touch with your side of the family. And that's fair. That's good. So it took me a little while. This is now about the 5th or 6th of December of that year when I had that telephone conversation. It took me maybe 5 days to get up my courage and to write the letter out. So it probably got to that city around the 14th or 15th of December. And I know that my brother's grandfather gave him the letter immediately. And I know that because on the 17th of December of that year, the grandfather died of a heart attack. So now you think about this. If we had waited just a few days, I don't think anybody else would have given my brother that letter. But because his grandfather did go ahead and give him that letter, we have been in contact for essentially all of our adult lives. And that's the power of family. That's the power of making those connections, of reaching out, even though you're afraid that somebody is going to say no, that they don't want contact, or that they won't put you in touch. We need to take some risks as family historians and put ourselves out there and risk getting hurt in the process. And that, I think, is probably the best family story I've got.
And that might have been the best story I've heard in 5 series. So definitely, I think, well, that accolade, that's for sure. Oh my goodness, I was like on the edge of my seat there.
It just is. It was
Brilliant.
so wonderful, and I have to tell you that my brother is one of the best parts of my life. There are a lot of things in my life that I've done that I have not been proud of, or that I've regretted, that I wished I'd done differently. There is nothing in this world about getting to that brother that I regret in the least. So that's been a good thing in my life.
I should just cut the interview short and end on that. One would ask, or no, 2 more. Don't want to keep here all day. So, what advice would you give to a young person starting out?
Get a basic education in genealogical methods, which is a fancy way of saying don't make the mistakes that I made as a baby genealogist. we come into this thinking, well, I know how to do research. I can do this research. This has got its own rules. It's got its own necessities. It's learning things like grandfathers put themselves down as bachelors when they're not, and grandfathers say that they're 21 when they're not. It's learning those sorts of things before we start putting it down in black and white. So start out by getting that basic education. And people today have so many opportunities to get that education very inexpensively or free. The webinars from Family Search, for example, which are all free. The Legacy Family Tree webinar series, which goes on sale, twice a year, to get a whole year's worth of access for a pittance. Those kinds of educational opportunities to know how to do it right so that we don't come back in 5 years and realize we've got to cut off an entire trunk of our family tree because we turn out we're not related. So that's my biggest bit of advice. The second thing is, don't listen to anybody who says you're too young. That's just dumb. Okay? I don't care if you're 12. If you know how to do it, you know how to do it. And you can be 60 and not know the first thing about doing it right. So it's not a matter of age. It really is a matter of skill. But there is one thing young people have that us old farts don't. And that's time with the living. Take a recorder, take a video camera, take your frappin' cell phone, and sit down with the oldest members of your family and record their stories. They may not all be telling you the truth. They may not remember things correctly, but that's an opportunity to document things, to get a sense of what life was like in the past that nobody else has. My grandparents are long gone. You kids, you still got living grandparents. Talk to them. Talk to them, record their lives. And then record your own. I haven't lived through anything important at the age of 18. Hello? How about 2.5 years worth of a pandemic? How about the collapse of the British government? How many times in the last couple of years, right? I mean, how about Brexit and the implications of that on your life? Family history isn't just what happened in 1800. It's what's going on right now in 2022.
Definitely. I was going to cut you off because it's important to mention that I don't have any living grandparents anymore. But my last one died 5 years ago. But I mean, it was a case of it's a case of even when I did so try and so that building it, I started January 2017. My grandfather passed away in May. I was able to, yeah, it was annoying, and it was another thing. Well, in that year, the last kind of oldest relative on my dad's side, was half of the country, died in June. So I mean, we really weren't having it lucky.
It can be hard. I never knew my grandparents on my father's side. They were both dead before I was born. So to this day, I have never met a relative on my father's side who is not a brother or a sister. The closest relatives I know of are second and third cousins.
Yeah, I mean, with my family, I'm trying to think. Like on my dad's side, obviously on his mother's side, the last one died in 2017. But the last one on his father's side died in 2008. So I imagine me as a little 4-year-old, almost 5. So like getting out little notepad and just like, tell me everything. No. But I mean, but what this kind of, it's as if people knew that, one of the kids was going to do it because this granddad died in 2008. She actually sat down one of her daughters did family tree of what she knew. So that's the only way I was able to get back. And oh, it was like, oh, please give me. It's like, I'll take care of it. I'll
Even
install safe.
just give me a picture of it. I'll take a photograph.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Definitely. I mean, that on my side, it's not me funny story I ever shared or talked about much, and that was kind of the one thing that kind of survived from one end of that family, and as well, even though my granddad who died, even though he's on now, I still have videos of him, and of when so during his life, and so like his laugh is infectious. Like even his for sentimental value, laugh is infectious. It'd be hard not to laugh on with him. So I mean, even with that, it's just nice. Nice, if you have a rubbish day. So no, I agree with on the recording thing, and I definitely would if I had thought of, imagine it was only a couple months, but still.
I
Um,
know.
so with okay, now this one's probably a little out of date because obviously things are changing. But I'll ask it anyway. So times ever changing, more and more young people are getting to uncertain their genealogy journey. In your own opinion, do you think that there is enough outlets for young people to connect people their own age with genealogy?
I think we all need to do better about making opportunities for young people to come into the field. What I've noticed in particular, and that I am delighted to see, is that there's a whole cadre from teenagers right into their 30s who are actively getting into genealogical research and doing amazing work, really high quality work in genealogy, and getting together with each other to help and support each other. And then there's a gap from that 30s age group or 40s age group up until the ones that I'm putting myself into the category of, which are the old farts in the 60s and 70s, where there's a gap in there that's going to be hard to fill leadership positions and editorial positions, and people writing journal articles and stuff like that. That's a negative for societies and that sort of thing, but it opens an enormous opportunity for talented and motivated young people to step into a leadership role at much younger ages than genealogical societies have seen in the past. Out of sheer necessity, you guys are the future. You're going to have to step up, or the field is going to really be in a world of hurt. So it's a black cloud silver lining type of situation. But where I think a lot of young people make a mistake is the assumption that they've taken a degree in history, or they've done very well in history, and that's the skill that they need to bring to genealogical research. The skills that are required for genealogical research are different, and they will require education. You do not go from being a historian, a general historian on day one, which is the macro history, to being a micro historian, the one-on-one genealogical historian, the next day. There's a learning curve. So there's some dues paying that's got to be done, some work that needs to be done. And I think that's an area where young people, and I know you're leading this, and PJ is leading this, and a lot of young genealogists are working together to make that happen, to make sure that those who are up and coming not only have the ambition, but have the skill to back up the ambition. And I applaud you all for it. And I can't wait to see what you bring to genealogy and how you change the field for the better as we go forward.
And I do definitely share your point about societies, because with the the tutorial and the other bits, and I'm doing presentations and things on it at the moment, but I kind of won't into too much without no one may just go off on a tangent. But kind of I think there's one in the meetings as well, that what societies use. For example, I said about Discord works because I was talking to someone, a genealogist, earlier this week about Discord and how it can be used uh, for what this genealogist is trying to achieve, and also it could be used for societies as well, because it's functionalities that could basically save societies money if that is as well. It's like they don't want to do mailing lists, because they can do some Discord that can tell members everything about what's happening, as well as like you can do meetings in it too. So it provides a world of functionality, and I hope to kind of bring back kind of into like push that out into this genealogy sphere, and so like show how it can be used, because the technology is there. I think there has to be, so like someone is thinking, we should try and do this, give it a try, or kind of ask somebody who might know about it as well.
Absolutely.
And I think
If there is one sentence I never want to hear from another genealogist or genealogical society, a phrase I would like to drive a stake through the heart of, it's, but we've always done it this way. Things need to change as new technologies and new people get involved. And that, I think, is something that you young folks are really bringing to the genealogical sphere.
and I mean, Discord has all been used, as I can see. We've one member of our John Pioneer representing E3,
Love to
and
have you,
they
John.
and they Discord for their operations. I'm a member of it, so I've seen it being used, and there are obviously two Discords that I know who use Discord, Genealogy, that server, and you've also just called Genealogy. Both servers use it really effectively, and both build very nice communities, and it's just really useful and can definitely be about this side.
Terrific. Daniel, this has been fun.
It definitely has, and I think that's a good note to wrap up on, considering I'd know how an hour and 7 minutes. So I think before I put to sleep, I think that's right. So thank you so much for coming on. It's been so much fun, and I've really enjoyed it.
It's been great fun to be here. Thanks for having me.
And thanks to everyone who tuned in tonight. And I can already tell you that the series 2 guest will announce it shortly on social media when I get the promotional things out. But instead of happening today, it'll actually be happening sooner. It'll actually happening Wednesday. It'll be audio only due to the request of the guest. So you'll have to wait and see what that is. So thanks everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time.